Tales from the Rails, discovering the Stockton and Darlington Railway. The railway that got the world on track.
Hello and welcome to our 10th Tales from the Rails, our monthly podcast on the Stockton and Darlington Railway, the railway that got the world on track. Now, Archie, if this is our 10th, I'm wondering why we don't have some sort of celebration cake. Missed a trick there.
Yes, if only both of us were free to eat cake.
My name is Caroline Hardy.
And my name is Archie Mackay.
I'm an archaeologist, an author, the editor and a trustee for the charity the Friends of the Stockton and Darlington Railway.
And I'm managing editor of South West Durham News, a small independent publisher of 4 community newspapers, including the Shildon and District Town Crier, produced right here in the cradle of the railways.
So this week on Tales from the Rails, we're talking about the evolution of the railway station on the Stockton and Darlington Railway from no such thing existing at all to the gradual development of this facility through trial, error and expediency. This month's star of the S&R will be Percival Tully, whose life encapsulates the typical life many of the people who worked on the S&R had, an incomer from up north who moved to the railway and ended up in America. You can find out more shortly.
We'll also be letting you know about the latest news, so get yourself a cup of tea, settle down in front of the fire and enjoy this journey back to a time when the railway station hadn't been invented.
Tales from the Rails. This podcast is brought to you by the Friends of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, a registered charity set up to safeguard and promote the heritage of the railway that got the world on track. You can join us by visiting our website at www.str1825.org.uk.
Well, this month we are looking at the development of the railway station on the Stockton and Darlington Railway. We need to acknowledge the research carried out by our late friend, Brendan Boyle, who did a fair amount of research into this before his untimely death in 2021. His research helped us to better understand the evolution of the railway station. Importantly, Brendan's work also led to the Railway Tavern in Darlington being listed and the former tavern at Heinton Station being upgraded from a listing Grade 2 to Grade 2 star.
So when the Stockton and Darlington Railway opened on the 27th of September 1825, the railway station hadn't been invented. By 1830, other railways had opened and were including stations in their design. The S&R was providing station facilities and passenger commuting was well established between these stations. So the period between 1825 and 1830 was one of huge changes as the railway company identified new needs and demands and attempted to prioritise investment in new infrastructure.
So, how did we get from no stations on the S&R to railway stations as an essential component of every modern railway? Presumably, the first thing to agree upon is, what is a station?
Oh, groan. This might seem like a simple question, but it's got a complicated answer. At its most basic form, it's obviously a place where trains stop, where they become stationary, hence the name. But the name didn't really come into common use until the 1830s. But think what stations are today. You can have vast concourses where goods and freight are loaded or unloaded, where passengers alight or depart from trains, where hospitality and shelter is offered. And these functions could be spread over a wide area and over several buildings. Think of big city stations like Newcastle or King's Cross. Or you can have intermediate stations which are no more than halts, like a bus stop. And there are larger intermediate stations, the rural station, which once had a stationmaster living in, overseeing the station's many purposes, which even in a rural environment would provide facilities for goods, freight and passengers. Very few of those exist now in a manned form. They were mostly closed as a result of the beaching cuts in the 1960s.
Hey, Caroline, you don't seem to have mentioned selling tickets.
Yeah, the selling of tickets to travel doesn't seem to be critical in the definition. Many smaller stations still don't sell tickets, although in the last few years they've been fitted with automated ticket purchasing machines on the platform. That's happened at Shildon fairly recently. But prior to COVID, tickets were purchased on the train, not at the station in lots of parts of rural Britain, again, such as Shildon. And it was only last year that Network Rail were looking at getting rid of staff ticket offices in favour of platform machines and internet purchases only. There was a big hoo-ha about that. No, I don't think we can hang it on tickets because they kind of come and go. Having said that, the depots, which we will look at shortly, did issue tickets of sorts, and passenger services were booked in advance at taverns or depots, but whether you got a receipt which might constitute a ticket is less clear. The whole facility was largely modelled on the stagecoach, and on the stagecoach you often bought your tickets on the coach, and that's largely what the S&DR started off doing.
So what started the S&DR developing stations?
The key to this is the provision of depots and taverns along the line. Depots were built by the Stockton and Darlington Railway, and taverns initially were provided by third parties, usually adjacent to the depots, or in the case of the Mason's Arms in Shildon, at the hub of railway buildings. But this marriage between depots and taverns would become distinctive of the S&DR and would ultimately lead to the development of the railway station.
What were the depots for?
Well, railway terminology at this time wasn't fixed. It was all new. Everything was new, so the terminology tends to change quite a lot. The railway company itself used all sorts of names for the same or different things, and it can be quite difficult to work out what they're talking about at times, and depot is one of those words. The S&DR used depot for a number of different places, but for the purposes of looking at the development of railway stations, I'm going to concentrate on what I call retail depots. These are not passenger facilities as such, but a place to deliver and collect goods or freight that was for sale. They differed from goods stations or goods depots where goods are in transit and already paid for. Presumably business was also discussed at the depots and news exchanged, although in the early days there was little in the way of shelter available to do this comfortably. Even the staff might only have a temporary cabin in the first few years of operation.
So when were the depots built? Were they there on the opening day?
Yeah, the depots were initially designed by George Stephenson, who was instructed by the S&DR to furnish the needful plans and specifications for building depots for coal, etc., at Darlington, Stockton and Yarm as early as July 1824. These depots were not complete when the railway opened in 1825, but they were complete enough to function. On the opening day, the depot at Darlington received 6 wagon loads of coal from the inaugural journey, and that coal was to be distributed to the town's poor. Others were built almost immediately after the opening, when it was obvious that cheaper coal and building materials could be transported and sold anywhere along the line, including one at Hyington, one at Fighting Cocks, and one at Early Nook, all of which opened in 1825. And as branch lines were built and the railway extended, others would be built throughout the late 1820s and 30s, and indeed they were adopted by the NER after amalgamation in 1863. So retail depots started in 1825 and continued along the east side of the country really until the beach enclosures of the 1960s. Although trains stopped at the depots and unloaded, they're not really railway stations, not in themselves.
So was the next stage to provide some out of the weather for depot users?
Yes. At the depots, customers, usually consisting of coal agents, farmers buying lime, or builders looking for materials, they could travel considerable distances to purchase large quantities of freight. So, for example, a coal agent would buy large quantities of coal suitable for domestic use and then tout it around the settlements selling at the door. This might be familiar to older listeners, and I count myself as one of them, who'll still remember the coal agent travelling along the streets shouting, "Coal!" as early as the late 1960s. I've got this awful feeling that our coal agent was actually travelling behind a horse as well, but I might have just imagined that. But wherever depot customers come from, they would certainly appreciate somewhere to rest, refresh, seek shelter, and in some cases have business meetings, maybe to agree prices. In 1825, the only depot to offer this hospitality was at the terminus of the Yarm branch, where Thomas Meynell had commissioned a tavern to be built next to the depot, and this opened in October 1825 along with the depot. This was the start of the depot and tavern marriage of convenience.
I recognise that name. That'll be Mr. Meynell from the opening day and the laying of the first rail.
That's the man. Mr. Maynell was chair of the S&DR and the person who promoted the Yarm band that played on the opening day, and he also chaired the opening day banquet. And yeah, he's the one who failed to give a speech at the laying of the first rail in 1822, so we've met him a few times in the S&DR story.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about his tavern.
Well, it's now called the Cleveland Bay. Yes, you can still go there and have a drink, so support your local heritage, have a beer. But at the time, it was known as the New Inn when it opened, and it was a multi-room tavern with room for lots of customers, but also business meetings. It may well have been the inspiration for the S&DR to commission other taverns next to depots in 1826, and this model of depot and tavern was moving along nicely towards being a railway station. But not all taverns on the S&DR would become railway stations. Each had a slightly different function, so we'll have a look at those. The next tavern after Mr. Maynell's New Inn to service the users of the S&DR was the Mariner's Tavern, advertised as an inn with a licence applied for in September 1826. It was rented by the S&DR from the Stockton Corporation and sub-rented to a landlord. The tavern was located at the railway company's wharf opposite the staiths on the River Tees, where coal and other goods were loaded onto ships for export. The tavern was therefore primarily designed to provide hospitality for the railway workers on the wharf. Interestingly, though, the tavern was also adjacent to buildings which had been leased from the S&DR to Pickersgills from the 7th of April 1826. Richard Pickersgill was a carrier. Think of his business as like a courier service today. He set up a passenger service on the railway in October 1825 and needed a terminus office for his rail coaches.
That's not the name I recognise. Wasn't Pickersgills the same company that had delivered locomotion number 1 to the railway in September 1825?
Yeah, basically, if you needed something shifting at that time, Pickersgills was the company you went to, and it was certainly where George Stephenson went to when he needed something moving, and in that case, locomotion number 1.
So was Pickersgills running a passenger service from his building next to the Mariner's Tavern?
I'm not sure. He might simply have been garaging his coaches there. The handbill advertising the passenger service from November 1825 says Pickersgills will take bookings at his offices in Commercial Street, Darlington. That's nowhere near his offices on the quayside at Stockton. But Percival Tully will take bookings at the depot in Stockton, and at this date, that's the Riverside Wharf area at Cottage Row on the quayside. So bookings are taking place on the quayside at Stockton in 1826. The coaches are being garaged there, but I can't be certain that the passenger service was leaving from there. And later, they'd leave from the public houses in the town centre anyway. The historian John Brewster wrote in 1829 of Cottage Row. Actually, you read this, Archie.
Okay. The railway is carried eastward from hence to 4 staiths or stages projecting over the river where the coal vessels take in their cargoes. Here is a commodious inn and offices where the railway coaches from Darlington, Auckland, Yarm, etc. are stationed and where the railway communicates with other inns connected with the river. This reference, only 4 years after the railway opened, actually uses the term stationed to describe the place where the passenger coaches were held, but it doesn't suggest that the passenger service left from there, just that the coaches were stationed here. Does that mean that the company's wharf was in effect a terminus station?
Well, the cluster of buildings certainly constituted a place to marshal passenger coaches. It had warehouses, it had railway offices, a carrier company and railway workers' housing, and a licensed premises to offer shelter and hospitality. So collectively, the railway station was being born at the quayside. But let's proceed with caution though and call it a proto-station.
Okay, so that's the proto-station at Stockton's Riverside, but the better-known depot is at St John's Crossing in Stockton. How was that different, or was it different?
That depot wasn't completed by the opening day, but had been commissioned along with the ones in Darlington and Yarm in July 1824 from George Stephenson. It was never the terminus, because that's on the quayside, so I guess it is wayside. It was also located outside the town, so it didn't really constitute a practical place to start a rail journey for passengers, despite what the plaque says on the wall outside, placed there originally in 1925. And incidentally, it was replaced by the Friends of the S&DR in 2018 after the original was nicked by what the S&DR would have called evil-disposed persons and damaged. And that plaque reads,
"Here, in 1825, the Stockton and Darlington Railway Company booked the first passenger, thus marking an epoch in the history of mankind."
And sadly, I actually just think that's wrong. However, it was a good location for a retail depot where customers would approach by horse-drawn carts, in any case, and quite possibly got a ticket showing what they'd purchased. Plans for the weighhouse were produced by John Carter, the S&AR's part-time inspector of masonry, and approved on the 19th of August 1825, so it would never have been ready for the opening. The depot was joined by an inn, the Railway Tavern, commissioned by the S&AR in 1826 and also built by John Carter. The inn would be open in 1827. The complex of buildings also included an agent's office. So by 1826, Stockton had two groups of railway buildings associated with the S&AR, both called depots. One on the quayside at Cottage Row, easily accessed by the town's residents on foot, consisting of S&AR wharves, warehouses, railway workers' housing, offices, coaching facilities, and a tavern, but no retail depot as this area was more concerned with exports. And another one at St John's Crossing, a retail depot with another tavern to provide shelter and refreshments for depot users, agents' offices and a weighhouse, but with no obvious link to passenger travel. The distance between the two groups of railway buildings was only about 170 metres.
So, we've covered Stockton and found a proto-station and a retail depot. What about Darlington?
Well, there was a similar cluster of station-like buildings developing in Darlington about the level crossing with the Durham Road, now High Northgate, or the A167 if you prefer. A Darlington depot was also referred to in the October 1825 advert for passenger services. The retail coal and lime depot was located at the terminus of the Darlington branch line just off High Northgate where the Cocker Beck is. This was quite a hike from Darlington's town centre and also half a mile from the main line, so it didn't really make any practical sense as a starting point for the passenger service. But the area around the level crossing would make perfect sense as the place where the horse-drawn passenger coaches would join the line. Perhaps the term depot referred to the wider group of railway buildings that were clustering around the level crossing at North Road. Each of these buildings was beginning to form a component part of a railway station. The railway company commissioned a goods station here in 1826, and this opened in 1827, and it would be converted into a passenger station, as it happened, properly in 1833. The road widened at this point to allow carts to approach the station ready for loading and unloading at its 5 arched openings. The level crossing also became the unofficial parking spot for railway coaches that were used for the passenger service once the passenger service was put out to contract and taken up by the public houses. These passenger coaches joined the line via a series of sidings. Finding somewhere suitable to park up the coaches became a competitive business for the coachmen from the various inns. The S&AR had to instruct them in 1827 where they should stand when they reached the line. Archie, you have a read of this.
In consequence of continued complaints respecting the standing of coaches, it is agreed that Longstaff and Co.'s coach be stationed for the ensuing month on the south side of the railway at Durham Lane, and Scott and Co.'s on the short siding nearest shade. What do they mean by shade?
That word confused me as well. Does it mean a shady spot? Is it an early word for shed? In fact, I've seen it elsewhere in railway minutes, so it's not a mistake. It does get used regularly. So I checked out the word, and the word shed is actually derived from the word shade. So there you go. It's a coach shed, and possibly something similar to what Pickersgills had at Stockton's quayside. In fact, later maps dating to 1839, by which time the passenger service had been taken back in-house in 1833, they show a building on the north side of the line joined to the main line by sidings, and it appears to be a coach shed. It's not necessarily the same one, but does suggest a continuity of use of passenger coaches being parked up along the line at the level crossing in Darlington. That's interesting because it suggests that the coaches are not being kept at the taverns pre-1833, but by the line. This area would go on to develop and become a real hub of railway buildings from the 1830s. So back to 1826, the S&AR company commissioned 3 railway taverns, one of which was at St John's Crossing in Stockton, which I referred to earlier. The one in Darlington would be located near the terminus of the Darlington branch line opposite the retail depot. The other was at Aycliffe Lane Depot at Hyington. Once again, we see the correlation between depot and tavern, and it seems clear that the primary purpose of these taverns is to provide shelter and hospitality for depot users and workers. The Railway Tavern in Darlington was a bit more than that, though. It was large enough to have rooms for overnight stays and stabling for horses. In fact, it became known as the Railway Hotel in 1829. It also appears to have had meeting rooms for business purposes.
It's quite far from the main line, though, isn't it? About half a mile?
Yeah, and it's too far from Darlington's population to have a role associated with passengers, so it really is just a railway tavern or even a railway hotel, but it isn't a station. Confusingly, for the historian wading through company minutes, there was also another depot at Darlington, where the Darlington branch line peeled away from the main line. This was where goods or freight wagons were checked, weighed and journeys paid for before continuing eastwards to Stockton. It was also where the locomotives took on water. There was no S&R paid for tavern here, though, but a railway settlement did eventually grow up here, called Hopetown, with its own tavern.
OK, so we haven't mentioned Shildon yet. Do we see a railway station evolving here?
Yes, but in a slightly different way. The Mason's Arms didn't exist before the railway, but may have been built during the construction of the line and when they were building the engine house and workshops at the point where the line went from being inclined hauled to locomotive hauled. So it certainly appears to be there by 1825. Now, the S&R company took over some of its rooms for booking journeys, and they rented one room as a director's committee room. It's not clear how soon this took place after the opening day, though. Subsequently, a waiting room was built on the opposite side of the railway, and by 1833, it was working as a station complete with a clock, and the Mason's Arms was put up for sale in 1835. Now, we've gone a long way into the 1830s, but the reason the sale in 1835 is interesting is because they describe what's there. And the tavern had all the facilities you'd expect of a tavern, such as a brewery and stabling, but it also had a landing place for goods. Now, half a mile up the road from the Mason's Arms, we had Mr. and Mrs. Adamson's public house, the Grey Horse. It was there before the railway, but they'd go on to provide a passenger service from Shildon to Darlington, and the first stop was probably actually at the Mason's Arm down the road because the Grey Horse wasn't anywhere near the railway line itself at that stage. So that doesn't make the Grey Horse a station, and there's much we don't know about the Mason's Arms, but it does evolve into a station. The period over which that happens needs further research. And I do find this a bit frustrating that we haven't had more research done into the Mason's Arms. I actually think it's probably a phenomenally important building in terms of the evolution of the railway station.
So, the S&R commissioned taverns at Stockton, Darlington, at least a pub at the quayside at Stockton, and rented rooms in the Mason's Arms at Shildon. But what about the other tavern the S&R commissioned at Hyington?
Well, this is where things start to get interesting. This tavern at Hyington, built in 1826-7, was not at the terminus of anything, it was wayside, about halfway between Shildon and Darlington. It was possible to step out of the tavern door straight onto a train. Like the other railway taverns, it was located next to a level crossing and a retail depot, which was open and functioning from 1825. In fact, this was the level crossing that locomotion number 1 was delivered to from Robert Stevenson & Co. in Newcastle in advance of the opening day.
By Pickersgills, who are now carriers on the S&R.
Exactly. It was also where locomotives stopped to re-water. It was also where the landlord lived, Matthew Turnbull. He was responsible for overseeing the depot as well as the tavern, and the landlord's family helped with the re-watering of the locomotives from the water tanks, such as Edward Turnbull. The Durham Chronicle, dating to the 15th of September 1827, reported that the Aycliffe Lane house immediately adjoins the railway between Aycliffe and Hyington. To that spot persons come in the most stormy seasons at all hours of the day and night to load and unload goods and to await the arrival and departure of the numerous coaches, etc., which now traverse the railway.
Well, you know, that sounds a lot like a railway station.
It certainly does. So we've got a building that offers shelter and hospitality to railway and depot customers and workers. It's part of a group of railway buildings consisting of a retail depot, a locomotive watering point, and a tavern. Oh, and there's a cabin for depot workers. It's wayside. It's where people wait to get on and off trains, and it's where goods are loaded and unloaded onto or off trains. But it did more than that. The railway company were refused a licence to sell alcohol here, and in Darlington, by the way, by the local magistrates who had a vested interest in the turnpike roads. It took several appeals to finally obtain the licence, during which time there were various witnesses who recounted for the inquiry how they used the tavern at Hyington, albeit without alcohol, or at least they weren't admitting to it. Several people mentioned using the tavern as a place to commute from for business purposes, usually to Darlington or Stockton. For example, in 1829, Archibald Knox stated that he travelled along the railway 2 or 3 times a week from Hyington, and Robert Crowther testified that his business often took him to Stockton or Darlington from Hyington, and that he always travelled by railway, which is a great convenience to the public, he said.
So we have evidence of business commuting from 1827 to 29, leaving at and arriving at Hyington Station.
Yeah, but there's even more. We also see references to the building be used to leave and collect parcels and packages which would be transported unaccompanied by train. In fact, the early adverts for the horse-drawn passenger service in 1825 mentions this provision and the costs. So unaccompanied parcels could be dropped off at the railway company office in Commercial Street in Darlington, or with Percival Tully at the depot in Stockton, but when the passenger service was handed over in 1826 to third-party organisations, presumably the carriage of parcels and packages went with them too. We'll take a closer look at the passenger service another time, but it went on to be provided not by the S&R, but by privately run taverns, based on that coaching-in model. So by the time the S&R's tavern was built at Hyington, it looks like it was a place where parcels and packages could be collected or sent off by train. In fact, John Hill, a witness at the inquiry, stated,
"There is a considerable passage of parcels and goods of every description on the railway for villages of Aycliffe and Hyington. I have taken up parcels myself at that house and seen many more people there for the same purpose."
So Hyington therefore has got enough of the roles of a railway station for us to be able to say with confidence that it was the world's first railway station. The S&R didn't set out to invent the railway station, but they gradually created it through a process of experimentation and adaptation.
So did they go on to build more taverns and stations?
Well, the company fell out of love with taverns, or in particular, they fell out of love with alcohol. Alcohol in engine drivers and railway workers and passengers don't really mix, and the impact that it had was a source of some consternation, so they didn't build any more. But they did take those elements at Hyington that Hyington had that excluded the provision of alcohol and went on to commission other buildings that they called cottages in 1830. There were Fighting Cock's, Early Nook and Yarm. Fighting Cock's was being provided with a tavern by the local squire, next to the depot and level crossing, of course. So there was no need for the S&R to provide one anyway. But they made it clear that their building should be a cottage for the accommodation of passengers and parcels and the sale of coal, lime, etc. So the Hyington model went on to be used elsewhere along the line by the railway, but without the demon drink. Instead, the building, or rather its staff, looked after passengers, dealt with parcels, goods and the depot, and they usually had a live-in stationmaster to oversee these functions, although that term was not being used at these early dates.
So the S&R had invented the railway station by trial and error. But when did they start calling these buildings railway stations?
Well, they used station as a verb immediately, but they still referred to most of their buildings as cottages until the late 1830s, by which time the word station was actually being widely used everywhere. This gradual evolution of the station meant that the S&R didn't open with grand, well-planned stations, but evolved their concept over time, helping to inform the development of later pioneering railways, such as the Liverpool and Manchester, the Leeds and Selby, and the Newcastle and Carlisle. The S&R also appears to be the origin of the classic Victorian and Edwardian station based around the stationmaster's house, and to have generated that strong connection between goods depots and railway taverns. So once again, the great experiment that was the Stockton and Darlington Railway invented aspects of railway travel that we take for granted today, They did that largely by trial, a bit of error, a lot of expediency. This role of the S&AR as pioneering, and therefore by its nature experimental, was recognised instantly by the national press. Here's a quote from the Times dated the 2nd of December 1825. "The success of the Darlington Railway experiment and the admirable manner in which the locomotive engine does all, and more than all that was expected of it, seems to have spread far and wide the conviction of the immense benefits to be derived from the construction of new railways."
Stars of the S&AR.
We've already mentioned a timetable or handbill advertising passenger services published by the S&AR, dated to about November 1825, and referring back to the services that had been operating since October the 10th, which stated, "Mr. Richard Pickersgill at his office in Commercial Street, Darlington, and Mr. Tully at Stockton will for the present receive any parcels and book passengers." And it is Percival Tully who is this month's star of the S&AR.
Percival Tully was born in 1794 and came from a farming background. He was the fourth and youngest child of Bartholomew and his wife Anne, née Collingwood, a native of Northumberland.
The family lived in Kibblesworth on the lower west slopes of the Teme Valley near Berkeley, south of Newcastle, until at least 1807. By 1818, Percival Tully had gone into business, running a water-powered corn mill at Urpeth, Kibblesworth Mill.
In late 1825, he was working as a clerk for the Stockton and Darlington Railway Company at their Cottage Row Stockton terminus, and it was in that capacity that Percival was mentioned on the handbill.
When the operator Richard Pickersgill, also mentioned on the handbill, took over the Stockton coach bookings for passengers, parcels and packages in April 1826, Percival was removed by the S&AR to the Way House Now Ready, next to their coal depot at St John's Crossing on Bridge Road in Stockton. This was about 170 metres away from the terminus.
The Stockton Way House, which still stands and is often referred to erroneously as a booking or ticket office, was loosely modelled on the toll houses of the turnpike roads of that time. Each combined an office supervising a weighing machine or weighbridge and a dwelling for the toll collector.
Toll income was the lifeblood of the S&AR, so the role of the collectors was vital. Tolls were based on the weight and type of material, such as coal or limestone, being transported, the distance carried, and, for coal, whether it was for export, from the Tees, down to London usually, or for land sale from the railway's depots. The weighing machines themselves were not ready for use until July 1826, but the weigh offices seemed to be brought into operation as soon as they were finished, collectors presumably estimating weights based on the capacity of the wagons. Tully remained at the Stockton depot until March 1827, long enough for the depot to be referred to as Tully's long after he left.
His next job was at the Darlington depot. Unlike the weigh houses at Stockton and Yarm, which could only monitor goods going to those places, the main Darlington weigh house supervised all wagon movements down the line from it. To do so, it was built not on the Darlington branch, but on the main line upstream, that is, west of the Darlington branch junction. It was clearly of great importance. However, there was also a depot at the terminus of the branch line, and it too had a weigh house.
Percival Tully, free of family ties and with no apparent attachment to Stockton, was eventually appointed to the Darlington Way House from March 1827 at a weekly wage of 21 shillings. Now, this was a good salary, more than the pay his predecessors had had in Darlington, but the railway company also gave him an additional duty, which was, besides attending to the weighing machine, he also had to examine the wagons as they passed the weigh house in order to see that the axles were properly greased by the engineman and report any cases of neglect.
The Darlington Way House was nearly a mile from the main facilities at Darlington, and in the 1820s had a very few neighbours anywhere near it. Places of social interaction, or to eat and drink after a toll collector's work was done for the day, were scarce. The S&AR had built an inn at Northgate, opposite the branch depot gates, that was ready for occupation in May 1827, but it was refused a licence by Darlington magistrates in September of that year and the next two.
There was, however, one inn already existing just south of Northgate Bridge where it crossed the Cocker Beck. Originally the Bridge Inn, it had been opportunistically renamed the Railway Bridge Inn by 1827 by its owner landlord William Gray. It's still there, it's a different building now, and it's now called The Bridge, for obvious reasons. William and his wife had two unmarried daughters, Alice and Jane, and for 4.5 years after being appointed to the Way House, Percival married Jane Gray at St Cuthbert's Church in Darlington on the last day of 1831. She was 26 and he was 37. Ironically, Jane and her sister had been the objectors to the S&R's Railway Tavern, 60 metres to the north. They didn't want it to have a licence. They argued at the Durham Michaelmas Sessions hearing that their Railway Bridge Inn was sufficient to afford all the accommodation required by users of the depot. Another inn surely wasn't necessary.
In the event, it was not the Gray's objection that was the nub of the appeal. Rather, it was the inappropriate behaviour of the Darlington magistrates that turned the case. As we have mentioned in earlier podcasts, and largely because we are still cross about it, 2 of the 3 justices for the town had financial interests in the Darlington to Stockton Turnpike Road, which they feared would be undermined by the new railway, and they had persistently tried to frustrate the progress of the company. But the S&R won their appeal eventually, and the new inn, promptly named the Railway Tavern, opened soon afterwards in 1829.
The Darlington Way House became the first family home for the Tullys, the baptismal record of their firstborn, William Collingwood Tully, in October 1832, citing the family abode as Cockerton and the father's occupation as clerk of the Railway House. But that accommodation must have proved inadequate for a growing family, or perhaps Percival's wages and position in the company encouraged him to progress beyond living over the shop. For in April 1833, he bought a lately erected and built mid-terraced house in the newly developed Alliance Street across the township boundary in Darlington, but just 150 metres from the Way House. Alliance Street, also known as Hopetown, and the Tullys were amongst its first residents, and it's this settlement that the visitor attraction down the road, Hopetown, is named after.
In August 1833, at the commencement of the company's taking back control of the passenger service so that it could be fully locomotive powered, Percy Tully or his assistants were given an additional duty by the management committee of seeing that the trains started from Darlington.
I have to say, I don't understand that phrase, making sure that the trains started from Darlington. Where else would the trains leave from in Darlington, apart from Darlington? I think more digging is required to find out what they're talking about there. The S&R were clearly happy with Percival's work and his adaptability. As for the year 1834 to 35, he was awarded a contract at the apparently generous sum of £130, equivalent to 50 shillings a week, for weighing coals and pumping water. The reservoir or water cistern for replenishing locomotives at Darlington was alongside the Way House on the main line at Hopetown.
Tully continued working for the S&R on a contractual basis. The contract awarded to him for 1836-37 was for weighing coals with no extra duties stated, but at £100 a year was less than he had been on, but still almost double the rate he had started on. It was renewed for another 12 months to the 31st of January 1838, and then again as the baptism of his and Jane's 4th child in October 1838, his occupation was still being given as toll collector.
The Tullys had been joined at Hopetown, although probably not in the same house, sometime around 1834 to 1836 by Jane's father, William Gray, who at about 90 years old had finally handed over the running of the Railway Bridge Inn to a tenant. Gray's wife, Jane Tully's mother, died in late 1833. William, gentleman of Hopetown, drew up a will in March 1837 that named Percival of Hopetown, aforesaid clerk to the Stockton and Darlington Railway Company, as one of his 2 executors. The will shows him to have been a man of property and not just in Northgate, which he dished out between his daughters. When he died at the end of 1838 and probate had been granted, which took until August 1839, he had willed the inn and its adjacent properties in trust to Percival's wife Jane.
One of the first things the Tullys seem to have done after William's death was to move into his house, a bigger one at the north end of Alliance Street in Hopetown, where they appear to have been at the time of the 1841 census.
Whether coincidental or not, William's death was followed by changes in Percival's life, most notably his parting from the Stockton and Darlington Railway, at least from full-time employment. At the baptism of his son Percival John in August 1840, Tully's stated occupation had nothing to do with the railway. He described himself as a brewer. And in the census 10 months later, he was recorded as a brewer and agent. Percival's career as a brewer was not a long one, as at the baptism of his daughter Alice on the 1st of January 1843, he was once again, and for the last time in documentary evidence, associated with the railway, describing himself as a railway agent.
The family were still living at Hopetown at that point, but the tenant at the Railway Bridge Inn left soon after, and the Tullys were installed at the pub by mid-1844. 2 more sons were born in 1846 and 47, while Percival was the innkeeper there. But then another change. The Tullys left Northgate and Darlington altogether, moving 10 miles to South Church near Bishop Auckland, where Percival took over the Crown and Anchor pub. The whole family, now 9 strong, was listed on the census of 1851.
Now, I think that pub is still there, and it's called the Red Alligator, but still serving real ale and food.
They probably serve cake there for afters too, Caroline.
I think a site visit is required to find out. Anyway, back to the 1850s. All lives have their ups and downs, and the Tullys' lives were about to change. That census return of 1851 didn't mention a single servant, despite there being 9 children in the house. This would be pretty unusual for the time. Does that mean there weren't enough funds to employ any, or were all the servants simply out for the day? Perhaps connected to this, Percival Tully was taken to court in 1851 by the creditors of William Gray, his wife's father, late of Hopetown in the county of Durham, gentleman deceased, which was to be settled by the court chancery in London. So Gray must have died with debts and the creditors wanted paying, and as Tully was the executor to the will, I guess it was his responsibility. There don't appear to be any newspaper reports of the court's findings, so we don't know the details or the outcome. Worse was soon to follow for Percival with the death of his wife Jane at South Church at the age of just 47 in April 1853. Actually, I wonder if her gravestone is at St Andrew's Church. It's probably something else to check out when we're checking out the pub. Percival was now left alone at the age of 58 with 7 of the children aged between 6 and 20.
Where could Percival turn for the next chapter in his life? Well, he decided to emigrate to that country of immigrants, America. The family sailed from Liverpool to New Orleans in 1854 and went to live at St. Louis, Missouri, 700 miles upriver from New Orleans. Missouri was a boom state at the time, with increasing migration from the 1830s to the 1860s. Missouri's population almost doubled with every decade.
In 1857, Percival Tully, and to be honest, we can't be 100% certain that he's our Percival Tully, of St. Louis County, commenced the process to buy, presumably a knockdown settler's price, 320 acres of land in Iron County, Missouri, one of many such plots put up for sale by the US government. Iron County, not surprisingly, had an abundance of iron ore within its borders, presumably one of the economic drivers behind the St. Louis and Iron Mountain Railroad, which was completed in 1857.
This Percival Tully died in St. Louis of an abscess in the abdomen in the week ending 31st May 1858 and was buried at the Wesleyan Cemetery there.
So I took a look on Google Earth, and the cemetery is still there. It looks a wee bit run down and some houses have been built along its margins. The road has some lovely houses along it, but quite a few are boarded up, and I guess this is what happens when Iron County becomes the Rust Belt. A common ending, sadly, for many post-industrial landscapes that we also see along some of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. So, on with some news. A few months ago, Durham County Council put in a bid to the National Lottery Heritage Fund for Strategic Heritage Places funding. This is for money to be spent in Shildon and Newton Aycliffe area. Well, they got the money, congratulations, and now a series of consultations have been taking place about how best to spend this money to give these communities a lift. The Stockton and Darlington Railway has been well represented by our chair, Niall Hammond, but others are there too with complementary aspirations, such as last month's guest, Dave Reynolds, on behalf of the Railway Institute in Shildon.
Works are now taking place at West Auckland and up to Greenfields Road on the Etherley Incline to construct the walking and cycling route along the S&DR. Engineers have also been carrying out boreholes to test the strength of the S&DR formation ready for the new decking on Stevenson's original abutments at the Gonless Bridge.
Funding has been provided from the festival pot for another round of beer, bread and cheese in Stockton. Hooray! This was a fun event first tried out in Stockton a few years ago, where actors go around the town centre playing the roles of the navvies after the opening of the S&DR. You'll remember, if you've listened to previous podcasts, at the end of the inaugural journey, the posh guests went to the town hall for a banquet, but the workers were treated to beer, bread and cheese in the local inns. I went to one of those events and also had live music. So it's excellent news that this will also be taking place again in 2025. There are also aspirations that a similar event could take place around Darlington's fine pubs, but we haven't found the resources to pay for that. So if there are any Darlington-based businesses out there who fancy sponsoring such an event, we'd love to hear from you. And thanks to Barry Thompson of the Friends and Nikki Halifax, Festival Director, for getting the Stockton resources in place.
Our local groups have been out tidying up the line again. The Darlington group has been out at Throstle Nest Accommodation Bridge doing big vegetation tidies and litter picks. The West Auckland Gonless group have now got a spin-off group calling themselves the Gonless Gladiators, and they've been out doing a grand job of tidying up the River Gonless area, which will, hopefully, get its new bridge in the next few months. The Heinton Group are also keeping on top of previous work to keep the car park area free of broken glass and fly tipping. And at Fighting Cocks, volunteers have done an amazing job of vegetation clearance so that you can now see the 1870s depot structures. They will be back soon with forester Ben Riley, who is helping with additional tree clearance where self-seeded trees are damaging the structure.
The Friends usually have their monthly meeting at the Railway Tavern in Darlington in December. That's our special Christmas one in our part in supporting our local railway heritage. There's usually some business to discuss, but we'll also take along food and nibbles and do our bit to support the pub. If you're a member of the Friends, you'll get an invite to this, and that takes place on the 5th of December.
There's also lots going on behind the scenes at the Friends. The coffee table book, that is a pictorial journey along the line, should be with the designer by the time this podcast goes live. We are revising a self-guided walk booklet for the Darlington Circular at the moment. As part of this, we are testing the walking route on Sunday the 1st of December. If you'd like to join us, get in touch. This is being funded by Husqvarna and one of the local councillors for Darlington, Councillor Sonia Kane, so thank you all.
Last month, we mentioned that our bid to the National Lottery Heritage Fund was successful. So we're now looking forward to how the Friends will function after 2025 to ensure that all the hard work we've put in place for the last 11 years will not be wasted and that the S&DR will continue to be protected and maintained. Volunteers, supporters and partnerships will be a big part of this, so we'll be consulting and asking everyone for their thoughts and help in the coming months. Part of this development will also hopefully see us take forward a project with Darlington Council for the restoration of part of Edward Peasy's house in Northgate. This will become our office and base, while the rear parlour will be restored as it was in 1823 when painted by Arthur Rankley, a big improvement on its sad state at present and part of regenerating Northgate, connecting the town centre with Hopetown Railway Museum. Now we've got a long way to go on getting Peasy's parlour looking as it did, and we will need help, but I'm pleased to say that thanks to Linda Drury, former archivist at Durham University's Special Collections, we now have 2 quills dating to 1825 to put in the parlour. We haven't got a table to put them on yet, but it's a start.
The S&DR Festival programme was announced last September, and the Fringe Festival is down to all of us to organise. It is worth mentioning that the celebrations will also be national. These celebrations are being organised by Network Rail, And you can find out more at railway200.co.uk. As always, links will be provided in the show notes.
We're applying for grant aid to Durham councillors at the moment to run classroom sessions and give primary school children along the line free copies of the book Little Loco's Big Day as a 2025 keepsake. We're offering free sessions for primary school children. We're doing readings and activities over 2025 to 2026. If your school is located along the line in County Durham, we've already written to you, so do get back in touch. We need to look at getting you booked in.
The next Globe will be going out in December. This is the Journal of the Friends, which comes out twice a year. If you want a copy, you need to be a member of the Friends, or buy one from our website, or you can hang fire and you can download a PDF in 6 months' time for free from our website. There is also an index there to help you find articles of interest. This index was compiled by Peter Brainbridge and is really useful.
You may have heard news about Historic England's Heritage at Risk Register in the news recently. This is an annual snapshot of the health of England's valued historic buildings and places. It helps to ensure that they can be protected and continued to be enjoyed in the future. This year alone, 124 sites have been rescued and their futures secured. One of those is the 1833 goods shed on North Road in Darlington, now the Welcome Building for Hopetown. However, another building has just been added to the register, and that is Harrington Station. So we'd been awaiting the budget with considerable interest. We'd been told that the community ownership fund that we'd been applying to help us save Harrington Station was going to be revived. You might remember that the fund was closed down as soon as the election was called, and we were counting on having access to that to help save the world's earliest railway station. Well, there was nothing in the budget. Now I get the country's economy is in dire straits and that the coffers are empty. But this is an economic regeneration project that can help to lift an area. That means for a relatively small investment, you get so much more back again, which benefits the community. So, to our politicians, to our Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and to our Chancellor of the Exchequer Rachel Reeves, and to the North East Mayor Kim McGuinness, if the world's earliest railway station is lost, it will be your fault, not ours. We did our bit. We raised over £120,000. That's over our 20% contribution to the budget. But you will have let us down and you will have let your community down. Heritage is part of the solution. Use it or lose it.
Tales from the Rails, steaming ahead to 2025.
So that's it for another month. The earliest of railway stations at Harrington is still under threat. Let's hope something miraculous happens to save Harrington Station soon.
Well, quite honestly, Caroline, it's a disgraceful state of affairs as we approach 2025. I mean, how embarrassing will it be if the entire world films the replica train going past the boarded-up windows of Harrington Station?
If you can help us find the missing £400,000 so we can buy it and do the emergency restoration works, for goodness sake, do get in touch and step up to the plate where our politicians have failed.
You can also help by getting the 26 miles of main line looking good for 2025. As you've heard, we've got great teams out litter picking, clearing undergrowth and making it look cared for. Here is a comment from one of our volunteers, Elaine Glover, who helped clear the vegetation at Fighting Cocks and made us laugh out loud.
I have never been so filthy. Coal dust up my nose, in my ears, in fact everywhere. But despite that tree, we did find the end of the old wall. Well, I thought that was the best recommendation for volunteering I've ever heard. Remember, you can also help prepare for 2025 by joining the Friends of the S&DR at www.sdr1825.org.uk.
And here's a reminder of other useful contacts. If you want to know what festival events are happening in 2025, go to www.sdr200.co.uk/programme.
And if you want to know what fringe events are happening, go to www.sdr200.co.uk/fringe-festival.
And if you can't find what you want at either of those sites, then get her on and organise it yourself.
Now, as Christmas is looming, please go to one of these websites and support us by shopping there. At www.therailwaystation.shop, we've got gifts for children to adults, all of which celebrate our railway heritage. You can browse through our Stevenson collection or our Hackworth collection. It's all UK-made stuff and it's all very tasteful. The Friends also have an online shop on our website. You'll find our publications, prints and badges there, as well as second-hand books. Next time on Tales for the Rails, we're going to break with tradition and have a star of the S&AR who's still alive. Tune in next time if you want to find out more. A big thank you, as always, to Dave Reynolds of the Railway Institute in Shildon for our theme music. And so it's goodbye from me, Caroline Hardy.
And it's goodbye from me, Archie Mackay.